Professor Urs Wiesmann, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you today, University of Bern. Will you just briefly describe the professorship you hold? I think it's geography.
Yes, it's geography and mainly dealing with development studies. And we have an interdisciplinary center, which is called Center for Development and Environment, which looks at mainly sustainability issues of economic growth and related to environment, and with a special focus on the global south. We have worked with large projects from the Swiss National Science Foundation in Latin America, in Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, West Africa, but then also East Africa.
This is the first project you have worked on in East Africa?
No, I have a personal long-term history with Kenya.
Yes.
I came here the first time in '76 to work on climate change on Mount Kenya.
How interesting.
And then in '88 I came together with my family, and I was a project head of a research development project. And since then I'm keeping in touch with my local academic partners. Yes.
And Professor, of course, you were here this week for the launch of your Socio-Economic Atlas. If I can just show it, Socio-Economic Atlas of Kenya, depicting the national population census by county and sub-location. And there was quite a fanfare and a launch I saw this week. And there were many things that caught my attention, and I'm hoping we can speak about that. What was the purpose of the research, and if you can describe the scope of it as well?
Yes, we are, with our Kenyan partners, we are working since long in the field of sustainable use of natural resources, water, soil, and its relation to farming systems, to urban development. So an integrated view on contextual development. And luckily I had 2 PhD students in the Kenyan Bureau of Statistics. And from there we developed, together with our other partners, the idea to present the 2009 census, where more than 38 million people were asked, quite an extensive questionnaire, and these results were never fully available or just in statistical volumes, which no one is using. So
you went into this statistical...
We went we had access to all these 38 million records. And then an important thing happened in 2010 when Kenya adopted probably one of the most modern constitutions of Africa, in Africa. And with that new constitution, the counties became more independent with this devolution of power from the central government to, so quite some duties were transferred to 47 counties. And we are collaborating in other projects with these county governors and county governments, and we realized that information for a knowledge-based decision-making is not existing at that level. That's why we said, okay, let's try to make an atlas which gives down to the single community information, which then can mainly also be used in these counties. So the atlas is built in a way that it gives detailed information on each community and then aggregates it up to the national level, so that every policy level in the country can get the aggregation level they want.
What were the metrics of analysis? So what were you looking for? Health indicators? What were the key parameters for you?
No, of course, this was a double-sided approach. On one hand, we looked at what are issues that are important for sustainable development, like water use, like population dynamics, like poverty, of course, as a very important aspect, the distribution of poverty, the distribution of economic activities by the population, or the whole education system. These are all aspects which we wanted to look at. Then we of course had to see what was asked.
Yes.
So it was a balancing act to get most of what was asked in that census into these themes.
And you know, I had a chance to look through the atlas. What seemed interesting was that Kenya, the population seems distributed across this belt.
Yes.
And then there is a lack of population.
Yeah.
And I think one of the points you're making is that that policymakers would be better focused on working with the population as opposed to with the area. Was that correct?
This was a question of how do you display information in such an atlas. If you display the information by coloring the surface of a community or the surface of you get a wrong visual impression. You think, oh, up there everyone is poor. Ah, this is all red.
Yes.
And Nairobi, where there are more poor people than in many of the other parts, you don't see.
Yes.
So we choose a display format which shows the size of the population and not the size of the surface.
Yes.
And that was a necessity in Kenya, where 80% are semi-arid areas with a low population density, and then the majority of the population is in the two main highlands, the lake region and central Kenya, and at the coast. So these, yeah.
And what were your big macro observations? If you look at, is poverty evenly spread? Is there concentrations of it? Have some communities been more effective? What conclusions can you draw?
Yes, what is quite obvious is the central Kenya, with Nairobi in the center up to Mount Kenya, is the area which is best off, with lowest poverty rates. Second, then also the lake region and Rift Valley are coming up. And interestingly, only a very small part of the coast, whereas the hinterland of the coast, then the semi-arid areas in transition, and then especially the pastoralist areas, they're still very poor.
Very poor.
And for me, this is an interesting finding that you see in the highlands. It is somehow the combination between a productive agriculture and an upcoming industry, which led to a diffusion of wealth. Of course, not everyone is reached, but the percentages are really lower than in other parts. Whereas at the coast, where you have the tourism, that did not have that diffusion effect.
It did not. It concentrated money.
It concentrated in the 2 kilometers of the coast, and what is behind is left.
Yes. And those indicators must have turned worse, given the last 12 months we've had at the coast have been quite difficult.
I'm sure if we would make it now, it would even look worse.
And you speak of the lake community. I mean, there are a lot of people, an analysis I've seen talking about the potential of a lake economy, where all these other... Are we seeing that develop, or what's happening around there?
It's interesting that the lake region is in many indicators still quite behind central Kenya, and it's quite difficult to explain why that is that way. It might also be...
When you say behind, quite what are we...
In terms of wealth, in terms of level of education, in terms of all these, in terms of access to safe water, almost all these indicators of wealth, they're quite behind still. But when you look at, let's say for instance now, the enrollment rates in schools, you see, especially in the Rift Valley, but also in the lake region, you see a growth coming, which you don't see in the pastoralist areas.
So they're still not going to school?
Yes, it's still, and it's very much confined to boys. So the gender
There's a big gender disparity.
A big gender disparity, yes.
In the pastoralist areas.
Yes.
And then in the Rift Valley, which is surely similar to the central province in terms of the productivity of the land.
Yes.
Are you seeing a similar potential that can it catch up with?
I think it is catching up.
Yes.
What especially those education indicators show that central Kenya is like satisfied, and now it is spilling over.
Yes.
Especially to those two regions.
Yes.
Yes.
And Professor, if we can dive into things like the urban-rural divide, everyone talks about urbanization. I read somewhere the speed of urbanization in Africa is unprecedented. Obviously, it's bringing other challenges. Yeah. What are we seeing between urban Kenya and rural Kenya? And is it chalk and cheese, or is it integrated? How would you characterize?
We have in the atlas, also for that interpretation, we have seen that almost all indicators have a strong gradient between rural and urban.
Yes.
Urban being better off than rural.
Yes.
In almost all lines.
So this urbanization, you are making a better living in the city.
Yes. Yes. Finally.
Yes.
Of course, what is still there is, which is also expressed, for instance, in the number of female-headed households.
Yes.
There is, the Kenyan population tries to stand on two legs.
Yes.
A rural leg and an urban leg, but what I observed in the last.
By that you mean that somebody in the city will have maybe a shamba at home. Yes. And the wife might be there or something.
The wife might take care of the shamba.
Yes. And
the kids going to school there, the younger ones, and the men trying to get an income in Nairobi or in another town.
Yes.
And but still the household decisions partly are taken together.
Yes.
But it's two legs on which one stands.
Right.
So if it is difficult in town, then you still have the security of home, and the other way around. So there's a lot of remittances also.
Yeah, in country,
yes,
but going
in country, and M-Pesa, the introduction of M-Pesa has increased that tremendously. Yes. And has created a new relation between rural and urban areas. Yes.
I saw some M-Pesa statistics which said all the money goes from the urban into the rural. Yes. And most of the phone calls are being made urban into rural, not the other way around.
Not the other way around, yes, yes.
Getting back to this point of these standing on two legs, then also all the media this week sort of were captured with this fact that there were 33% of households in Kenya were female-headed households.
Yes.
Obviously, one example you're just giving is the wife is sitting at home, bringing up the children. But are we also finding women in our urban cities deciding to bring up the children by themselves, or?
Yes, the majority is of that type, the rural female-headed household, which either the man has gone for work into urban, or in the lake region, that is also quite often that the man has died.
He's died.
So these are widows or grandparents who are bringing up the kids.
So why were they dying in the? Well, you said that as if there was a statistic.
It was the HIV pandemic was there, had there a much higher impact. You see it on.
Is it still higher in the lake?
The prevalence rates are still slightly higher, but they're coming down. Okay. Like generally in Kenya, they're coming down. And you also find, for instance, a map of the orphans. Yes. And you see it directly confined to the lake region. Is that right? The number of orphans, a very impressive map. But then there is a third type, which mainly happens here in central Kenya, where highly educated women migrate into urban areas, have a female-headed household, or they group up into a household. So there is a move also of the highly educated, of an emancipation which is going on.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, and that's what I can add to the rural-urban gradient or divide. when we started work 30 years ago here in Kenya, this was very clearly a rural-dominated culture.
Here.
Yes.
And now?
So everyone, when you were asking someone young, what do you do with your first earned money?
Yes.
You would say, I buy land.
Yes.
Because that is the real security.
Yes.
On the weekend, Nairobi
Yes.
emptied out, people went to the rural homes. And now, in the last 10, 15 years, there was a turn in the sense that the urban culture has taken over strongly.
Yes.
And with even this, for instance, this language Sheng
Yes.
is a typical urban
Development.
which
Yes.
is coming. There is, if you ask someone young now, what will you buy with your first money? It will be a car.
Oh, really?
And the land will come much later.
Is that
yes,
right?
Yes. So there's really a cultural change, which is also expressed in music, in the bongo, and in all these things. So,
talking about cultural change, I often find, I was talking to somebody who was telling me that the new generation, for example, he was describing how somebody resigned by sending a text. And my question is, with a population that's so young, average age is what, 18?
Yeah, 50% are below 18.
Isn't that potentially revolutionary in how the society changes, because you've got so many people who are so young, they're all connected to the internet. Yeah. What are you seeing in that respect?
There's an interesting observation we made concerning mobile phones.
Yes.
In 2009 there were not so many yet.
Yes.
But now the mobile phone, and especially the smartphone,
yes.
Was not just diffusing like a normal diffusion pattern would be, that first the wealthier have
Yes.
it and then it slowly spreads. It immediately went even below the poverty line.
Really?
And it becomes a key asset of business.
Yes.
If you have an informal, 44% of all Kenyan adults are in the informal sector.
Yes.
Not in agriculture, not in the formal sector. So this is a very high figure.
A high figure for any economy.
Yeah. And then the smartphone becomes an asset within this informal sector.
Yes.
And with M-Pesa, so that it's even your bank.
Yes.
So interesting, that shows the innovation power also of the poor.
Yes.
That it even went to the poor quite fast.
And so quickly.
And so quickly, and also to the pastoralists.
Yes.
Who are now communicating where did recent rainfall and all this.
Yes.
So that it even influences the pasture management.
Is that right?
And I think this, if I now observe over the years, my students, for instance, at the University of Nairobi, where I keep a part-time job, when I see the change which has taken place just within 3 generations of students, then I really think this opening up to the world through this
mobile phones,
communication technologies, internet,
yes,
is changing a whole generation now very fast.
Yes.
And you are very right. This is, I would not call it a revolutionary power, but it's a power of change.
Yes.
And perhaps not enough taken into consideration by the current generation of politicians.
Yes, I think I agree with you.
Of course, in traditional African, in that rural African culture, the elders were the ones to have the say.
Yeah.
But it might turn, and this turn might come from the urban areas.
Yes.
Yes.
And now, Professor, you were telling me just before we started speaking that you looked at a couple of countries in Asia as well.
Yes.
Are there any broad similarities or differences that we can infer? Because I meet a lot of people who, look at Africa from an economic point of view and say, this is the next Asia, and then tell me, but it's not happening at the same speed, and this is not happening. What are there any observations we can draw from your research? Was it in Laos or
Laos and Vietnam? Yes.
Yeah. Because those are surely similar.
Laos is far behind Kenya.
Is it?
Far behind. Kenya is already in an economic transition.
Yes.
Where this is a very important finding which no one believed.
Yes.
A very big surprise. Only 33% of the labor force are still in agriculture.
Here. 1 in 3.
If you ask any
Yes.
official, he will tell you 70%.
Yes. And it's not.
It's not. It's 33% who
Yes.
take their main living out of farming.
Yes.
And but almost half of the population still holds animals.
Yes.
So you can say there is agriculture becomes a secondary income.
Yes.
Or let's say that security part which you keep, but your main occupation is now in the other sectors.
Yes.
And in Laos, that is, in Vietnam, the speed is probably around the same,
Yes.
like in Kenya. But also when you look at education levels, we calculated the education levels of Kenyans, and in average, all the adult Kenyans living today have finalized primary school. This is
Yes.
much higher than, I don't know, we don't have, but if we estimate, it is much higher than in most other African countries, but also in many Southeast Asian countries.
Is that correct?
Yes.
How?
Yes.
Wow.
It's and these dichotomies between urban and rural, between the economic centers and the rest, I think there are also, that is perhaps going to the similarities.
Yes.
That's what you observe in any economy that starts to take off.
Yes.
And I think Kenya is on that line.
Do you believe it's taking off?
I think it's on that line. Even if you look at the growth rates,
Yes.
they didn't reach the growth rates of China, but at
Yes.
least 5-6% was there in the recent past. And so, and I also think the societal change is quite fast.
Yes, that's my impression.
So I think we are experiencing a nation which is really at that verge of a taking off, with all the problems
yes.
that are related to it, of
Yeah.
course, with all these transitional problems of governance, of economic disparities,
And for the average Kenyan,
gated communities, all these
yes,
things.
is that going to change though? It isn't, is it? You know, that's going to remain, isn't it? That sort of.
If we consider that still 42% of the population are below the poverty line,
Yes.
then let's say that rift between those who have
Is growing.
Yeah, it's not only the rich, it's also the middle class, which is
Yes.
growing.
Is the middle class growing?
Yes, the middle class.
How did you establish that?
We calculated, that is a bit complicated, we calculated a so-called wealth gap.
Yes.
That means the poverty gap is when you have the poverty line, then you calculate how far below the poverty line are the poor,
Yes.
in average. And what we did, which showed that, and for instance the hinterland of the coast is the poorest.
It's the poorest.
Yes.
Hinterland of the coast is what?
Yes.
Kilifi.
Kilifi, yes. Just everything which is behind the coast.
But why is that so poor? What?
It is related to tourism, which is not diffusing the income,
Okay.
because it is controlled by too big money,
Yes.
where then the local benefits are much smaller than
Yes.
the external benefits. And then the job market which is offered is not a mass job market, which could then spill into modernization of agriculture and all this. So, and perhaps there's also some cultural aspects, at least if we look at the difference in education between male and female,
Yes.
it might be
There's a
related also
discrepancy, is there?
to the faith which is dominant there. So, but to come back to the wealth gap, we calculated those who are not poor, how much above the poverty line are they, and there you can clearly see in central Kenya,
Yes.
and not only in Nairobi, in central Kenya, parts of the rift, even parts of the lake,
Yes.
that wealth gap is quite broad. That means you have there a middle class coming.
Yes.
Whereas in other regions, those who are not poor are just very slightly above the poverty line.
Yes.
That means if you have a drought or a market change in livestock marketing or something, they fall.
So what are the safety nets for those sorts? Because that's a big part of Kenya, right?
Yes. Yes.
That's the whole livestock community.
Yeah.
And interestingly, Professor, from what I can see, all these recent oil and gas finds are actually in more of the deprived areas of Kenya. Yes. And that's why we're seeing so much friction.
Yeah, the question will be whether the local population will have a chance to profit from that.
Yes.
That question is very big.
Yeah.
But you were asking of the safety nets. There are some interesting observations we are making, especially also in the pastoralist areas or in the Kamba areas, where in the more drier areas, where the main source of income for many people is not livestock keeping anymore, but is in the informal sector.
Such as what would they be?
Anything, metalworks, beauty salons, any type of these small scale.
So service economy.
Service economy, but also this Chuankali manufacturing things, petty trade. So the economic diversification is one of the lines, and the other one is, which I mentioned before already, is we call it the multi-local households.
Yes.
That you try to spread the family members and your relations. That's why it's so important to invest into your family relations, because they finally build the security net. That's interesting. Between the different parts of the country.
And I suppose that's why funerals become so important.
Yes. And this is a very rational investment, because you are investing into social capital.
Yes.
On which you can draw later.
Yes, that's a good way of looking at it.
Yes. So it's economically very, very valid.
And I suppose also having a network gives you an advantage in such a situation.
Of course, yes. Well, it's also interesting when we look at migration patterns.
Yes, well, tell me about that, because
yes, you see a very clear, very dominant migration
Central
into urban,
Kenya migrates.
Yeah, into urban areas.
Yes.
So there's a very strong rural-urban migration, and what is interesting is, if you look at the informal settlements of Nairobi, like Kibera, Mathare, and so on, you see that it is the relatives network which allows you entry into town, into the slum, and from there you then make your economic rise. And then there you see it, the communities are not yet mixed, and they mix when the economic activities are there.
Is that right?
Yes.
So economics is mixing the communities essentially.
We calculated a very interesting thing, how many communities in average are in one sublocation.
Yes.
And there are more than 7,000, including all those up there in northern
community.
Single communities, and we calculated how many ethnic groups out of the 34 are represented in each sublocation, and the average is 12. 12. So there's already a big mix of communities all over Kenya.
And it's not skewed in one community's favor?
No. And the interesting thing is, only 90,000 people in Kenya live in a community where there's only one tribe.
Is that right?
All the others
are having to mix.
Are mixing in 30 million people.
And this is a recent phenomenon?
It is related to the economic development. The better an area is developed,
it brings in more
the more mixed the population is. And that means a policy which builds on ethnic divides is against the economy finally.
That's a very, because quite often that's how politics has been played here, right? Because of the numbers.
Yes.
So you put your numbers in one place, but you're saying that is working against the economy.
Yeah, it's finally working against the economy, because it seems that from these findings, it seems that the mix the cultural mix produces the innovation.
Yes.
And not the cultural homogeneity.
But are we seeing intermarriage between communities yet, or has this sort of mixing led to mixed tribal marriages in the cities? Maybe
there I can. This one we have not looked at, but it could be analyzed out of the data. But out of my own observation, especially in the higher levels of the society, the more educated, you find quite some ethical mixed couples.
Yes.
And especially after independence, that move was quite strong.
Yes.
And with the politics concentrating so much on tribal issues in the recent 2 or 3 decades, I guess it has rather gone down a bit again.
Yes.
But it is something which is still there. And I guess over time, and with this rural-urban divide becoming even steeper and the urban culture becoming the dominant,
yes,
this mixing will take place.
Yes, yes. So in fact that should also change the political landscape as well, and hopefully make it more issue-based.
Yeah, it's... perhaps one was also reporting too negatively about what was achieved by the different governments here in Kenya. To manage this economic transition which takes place is a very difficult task.
Yes.
And of course, power plays a role, numbers play a role. But at least our atlas shows that still a lot of things were achieved.
You're painting quite an optimistic picture. Are you a natural optimist, or what you've seen sort of, or you've seen?
I was here by coincidence. I had a sabbatical in 2008 when those unrests broke out.
Yes,
those violence,
yes.
And I experienced them directly myself. And many of my friends were directly affected, and there, especially the Western press was drawing a very dark picture.
Yes.
And Kenya is falling back into the Middle Age, and I then started to explain why these things happen, because these are phenomena of growth.
Yes.
It is a country in fast social and economic transition, and that gives a lot of frictions.
Yes.
And it can explode.
Yes.
But I was quite sure that within a very short period a solution will be found, and it was very impressive how in the first 3 days this middle class we talked about started private advertisements on TV to stop the violence. So there are more and more also economic interests who look at this country as a country and try to increase its position in the world instead of looking at the rivalries within.
Yes.
But of course these are
that's the key. That's the idea of the national interest.
Yes, exactly.
Which was sometimes is not there.
When I read newspapers, then sometimes I think, it's too much about persons and about divide, and not enough about issues. But when you look at also what private investors are doing, what communities are doing, even in poor environments, to better their lives, how people are suffering to educate their children. That is something which is incredible.
Yes, there's a very strong commitment to that.
Yes,
is that unusual in the world? There seems to be a very strong faith in that.
I think it's extraordinarily strong here. Yes, especially in central Kenya, but spilling over now also to the rift and to the lake. And I think this is a big asset for Kenya. And that they have not only Kiswahili as a national language, but also English.
Yes, yes.
That gives them a special position in geopolitically in East Africa. And Nairobi is still the economic hub of East Africa.
You feel that's borne out by what you're saying.
Yeah. Even if Dar es Salaam, of course, has similar growth rates,
Yes.
but Nairobi is still the economically seen. So, of course, I see many negative things, but I also see a lot of good trends, and Kenya will still face a lot of problems, but I think there is a broad will around. If we think of development, we should not only think of governments. I think the possibility now to have these county governments to
Are you optimistic about the county governments?
In German we have a nice word which is called Jein. That means yes, no. The problem I see at the moment is that you see those 24 years of Moi, they cannot just be scrapped. That president being almost outside of the law.
Yes.
And what, at least in some counties, you can observe that this image of a governance is reproduced on the local level. And that, of course, leads into frictions. But there are also some young governors and their assemblies which try to control that. And this atlas, to come back to it, I think is an important tool also to make decisions at this level fact-based and knowledge-based and not only power-based. And it will certainly...
That of itself should be a dramatic improvement.
Yes. In my view, on the long run, this will be a very good move, the county governance. It might be that in a later stage one might regroup them, because 47 is a lot.
Yes, that's
and
the idea.
And it has really blown up the whole
budget
and everything. But as a principle to decentralize decision into the context so that they can be more context. A policy decision for Wachir County with pastoralists is very different from Meru or something like that. So to have a more contextualized response to needs is generally positive. I'm sure the competition between central government and local governments will continue for quite a while, but I think they will find the way to harmonize the two.
Professor, thank you so much. I really appreciated it, and a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
The professor was the main author of this extraordinary socio-economic atlas of Kenya, which I think will be reading for everyone. Thank you so much.